Thank you all for being here tonight. I also want to thank the Seattle Metropolitan Police Museum, which has also been encouraging people to attend. A Different Shade of Blue tells the story of how women have changed the face of police work through the voices of Seattle women, as Rick said. Seattle is the actually logical place to start because it has such a lengthy history and was at the very beginning. Tonight we have three women who represent different eras and different times in the sort of history of Seattle police, and I'll be introducing them in a few minutes. Before I do that, I wanted to give you a little background on why I wrote the book and also the history of police and the role of women in law enforcement. I first became interested in this book when, as a prosecutor, I was chatting with a policewoman one day in court. We were waiting for our case to go out, and her name was and is Cece Doucet. And so Cece and I were just chatting. I said, "So Cece, when did you come on?" And she came on the department in the late 70s. I said, "Well, were there a lot of women?" She said, "No, very few." I said, "Well, how did the men treat you?" She said, "Well, they kind of broke into three camps. Most guys were fine. They let us do our jobs. Then there was a group of old-timers who didn't believe women belonged in law enforcement, wouldn't even acknowledge us if we walked past them in the hall. And then there was a third group of men who thought, well, the women are here, we might as well date them." And I thought, this sounds like kind of an interesting story. And I originally conceived it as being like a lengthy weekly article for a newspaper or magazine. However, when I started interviewing women from the 1940s, including one of the women who is on the panel today, and found what was going on in the policewoman era versus what was happening with modern female officers today, I realized it's a much bigger story. Women have been in the police world much longer than 100 years, actually. They used to serve, starting in the 1820s, 1830s, as matrons. They were not police officers. Their job was to help escort and take care of female prisoners in jail, and young children in jail as well, if they were arrested for whatever. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the idea of getting women as commissioned police officers came to light. It was part of the suffrage movement. And during that period of time, as women leaders were pushing for the right to vote, they also were pushing for having female officers in police precincts because male officers were not perceived to be as sensitive to the issues of children, young women, and wayward girls, as they were called back then. And this, of course, is before Child Protective Services and a lot of government agencies that we have now that get involved in these things. So in 1910, actually, the city of Los Angeles appointed the first policewoman. Her name is Alice Stubbins Wells. And her job was part police person and also policewoman, and also she traveled around the country advocating for other departments to do the same. Seattle was right there. In 1911, the city council created 5 positions. By 1912, we had 5 policewomen on the street. And this is not really surprising because Seattle was at the very beginning of the women's movement. In fact, we had the right to vote here in Seattle and Washington State 10 years before the National Amendment. And Seattle elected the first female mayor of a major city in the 1920s. What I found as I did my research is that the policewoman era was very different, as I said, from our modern era, if you will. First of all, the policewomen that were hired up until the 1960s were segregated on women's bureaus and women's protective service departments. They were not allowed to work with men the way they do today in the squad cars. They were separated. They were paid often less than their male counterparts. They were not allowed to take promotional exams alongside the men. They could only stay within the women's bureau. The women needed to have college educations, whereas the men were hired with high school degrees. So the women's bureau was actually the best educated department in the department. And this continued on until the 1960s, when a woman named Felicia Spritzer in New York City sued the New York Police Department for the right to take a sergeant's exam alongside the men. She ultimately won, and by the end of the 60s, women's bureaus were segregated, the police departments were desegregated, and women started moving throughout the department. However, there was still one area, one bastion of all maleness that remained, and that was the world of the beat cop. And in the 1970s, when that barrier was broken, the proverbial you-know-what hit the fan. First of all, the officers had to get used to having females in their car. The wives of officers were frequently not happy with having very attractive young women in the cars with their officers 8 hours a day, their husbands 8 hours a day. And the police brass, not so sure how to handle it, and the public was a bit baffled by it all, too. So that introduced sort of the modern age, as I would call it, but still there are many challenges that women faced, and even today, women are not treated necessarily equally. In California, just this summer, there was a $5 million lawsuit settled where 14 policewomen were suing the Hayward Police Department for many different accusations, including that they were being pressured to have sex with the male officers, that if they did, they would get promoted easier. If they didn't, they'd get retaliated against. And the city settled for $5 million. So it wasn't, obviously, and there were declarations made by the city founders that this department needed to be seriously overhauled. So the issues that women have faced continue to be faced, although we've made a lot of progress. Well, first of all, I'd like to introduce the women on the panel. To my immediate right is Jean Dunbar. Jean first came on the Seattle Police Department in 1947.
Right.
And at that time, you might want to pass the microphone over, I guess, to her. And at that time, she first came on the department because she was a reporter for the Seattle Star newspaper. And she got hired to work as the first public information officer for the Seattle Police Department, where her job was to write speeches for the chief and issue press releases and so forth. But at some point, isn't it true that you decided that maybe police work was more interesting to you? Could you explain that?
Well, actually, I was a reporter at the Seattle Star. My degree was in journalism, but it was bought out by the Seattle Times and closed on August 13th, 1947, and I was out of a job. I was approached by a sergeant on the police department when there was a change in administrations. George Eastman was the new chief, and he wanted to beef up the Public Information Bureau. At that time, there was no funding provided for a public information program, so I had to be a police officer. So I did become a provisional policewoman, took the exam, passed the exam, and became a policewoman. And there's really very little difference between being a police officer and a reporter. You're after facts, you're doing the same job. So that's now history.
But initially, your job was to do, you didn't
Work
do
with
actual police.
media
Right, you
and
switched
work
at some
with the
point.
public. We did a lot of school programs. We had a terrific show for high schools. We had a policeman who was a professional trumpeter, played with all of the major bands in the country. He was fantastic. And we had other artists on the department. So we took this program into the high schools just to become closer to kids and show them that, you know, we're human beings. We also had the Dangerous Stranger, which I think everybody's heard about.
That's where you warn children about dangerous
Yeah, we
strangers.
went to summer camps and to the parks and schools, so we were out in the public. And then also television was just new then, and we also did television shows in cooperation with the stations starting up in Seattle.
Thank you. Sitting next to Jean is Marilyn Mclaughlin. Marilyn has the unique history of being the very last woman hired as a policewoman on the Seattle Police Department. And that was in 1969?
Yes.
And after you were hired, a lot of women in the Women's Bureau, the policewomen, went either into detective work or sought promotional exams like sergeant and so forth. But you didn't. You decided to go into patrol at a certain point. Is that right?
Yes. The Women's Bureau had been disbanded by then. There was 3 of us in my academy class, 3 women. We went in a juvenile division, but by then IACP, the International Association Chief of Police, had already come in, and women had been disbanded throughout the department, working in various detective divisions. I was a detective for 18 years before I went on the street, and I first went to traffic, and then I went into patrol, and I retired out of patrol, so I kind of did everything backwards. And had I known how much fun patrol was, I probably would have fought harder to get into it earlier, because that was fantastic. I really liked working patrol. That was the best experience on the whole department. And like I said, if I'd known how much fun it was, I would have tried harder to get into it earlier on.
So Marilyn, how tall are you?
Well, I used to be 5'11". I think I shrunk a little bit.
So when you came on the department in 1969 as a 5'11" woman, you were quite a presence in front of the men, were you not? I mean, they weren't used to women that tall with that much presence.
We had a few tall police women, but You know, on the street, when you get that vest on and you get a ponytail up to here and your gloves on and stuff, it's kind of... Yeah, I had a few guys tell me I was intimidating. So, you know, whatever works, whatever works.